The gunshot that shattered the morning silence sent every bird within a mile radius fleeing into the pale Arizona sky. And Preston James knew, without looking, that someone had just made the fatal mistake of disturbing his peace. He lowered his coffee cup slowly, dark eyes scanning the ridge above his small cabin, nestled in the scrubland just outside Williams, Arizona. The year was 1876. And in the 3 years since he had settled in this remote corner of territory, he had made it abundantly clear to anyone fool enough to venture near that he preferred the company of his horses to that of any human being. The shot had come from the direction of the main road, perhaps half a mile distant, which meant it was not his immediate concern. Preston had learned long ago that other people's troubles had a way of becoming your own if you let them, and he had no intention of letting anything or anyone disrupt the careful solitude he had constructed around himself like a fortress. He finished his coffee standing on the porch, watching the dust settle in the distance. The morning was crisp despite the season, and he had work to do. His 3 horses needed tending. The fence on the eastern pasture required mending, and he had promised old Gerald Thompson in town that he would break a young mare that had been giving the man trouble. Preston was known for 2 things in Williams: his skill with horses and his absolute refusal to engage in social niceties. He did his work, took his payment, and left without so much as a farewell. Some called him rude, most called him strange. He called it survival. The war had ended 11 years ago, but for Preston, it might as well have been yesterday. He had left Tennessee with blood on his hands and ghosts in his mind, drifting west with no particular destination in mind, until he found this place where the desert met the pine forests, where the sky stretched so wide and empty that sometimes he could almost forget the screams of dying men. Almost. The solitude helped. No one asking questions, no one expecting anything from him except what could be accomplished with horses and hard work. He was saddling his bay gelding when he heard the wagon. The sound was unmistakable, the creak and rattle of wheels moving too fast over rough terrain, accompanied by the labored breathing of horses being pushed beyond their limits. Preston's jaw tightened. The main road was visible from his property, and he made a point of never looking in that direction when he heard travelers pass. Whatever drama was unfolding out there was none of his business, but the wagon did not pass. Instead, it turned onto the narrow track that led to his cabin, and Preston felt a cold spike of irritation run through him. He stepped away from his horse, one hand moving instinctively to the revolver at his hip. The wagon came into view moments later, listing badly to one side, pulled by a pair of exhausted horses that looked ready to collapse. The driver was a woman, he realized with some surprise, her dark hair coming loose from its pins, her face pale with fear or exhaustion or both. She saw him and pulled hard on the reins, bringing the wagon to a shuddering halt 20 feet from where he stood. For a moment, neither of them moved. Preston could see blood on her sleeve, though whether it was hers or someone else's, he could not tell from this distance. Behind her in the wagon bed, he glimpsed what looked like supplies, hastily packed and already half spilled across the boards. "Please," she said, and her voice carried across the space between them, cracked with desperation. "Please, I need help." Preston said nothing. He had learned that silence was often the most effective way to make people understand they were not welcome. But this woman did not take the hint. Instead, she climbed down from the wagon with visible effort, stumbling slightly as her feet hit the ground. Now that she was closer, he could see she was young, perhaps 23 or 24, with green eyes that held a fierce determination despite the obvious fear. "There are men following me," she continued, moving toward him. They killed my father 2 miles back. They want the claim deed he was carrying. I need somewhere to hide just until they pass. Please." Preston felt something twist in his chest, an old instinct he had thought long buried. Her father was dead. Men were hunting her. None of this was his problem. He had not asked for this complication, had done nothing to invite it into his carefully ordered world. The smart thing would be to send her back to the main road, tell her to ride hard for Williams, and seek help from the sheriff there. "Sheriff's office is in town," he said, his voice rough from disuse. He rarely spoke more than a few words at a time these days. 2 miles west." "They'll catch me before I make it," she said, and he could hear the tremor beneath her words. "Please, I'm not asking for much. Just let me hide the wagon, hide myself. I'll be gone as soon as it's safe." "Not my concern," Preston said flatly. He turned back toward his horse, dismissing her. It was cruel, perhaps, but kindness was a luxury he could not afford. Kindness meant involvement, and involvement meant pain. He had learned that lesson too many times to count. "My name is Hannah Bailey," she said behind him, and something in her voice made him pause despite himself. "My father was Cornelius Bailey. We've been prospecting in the mountains north of here for the past year. We found something valuable enough that the men who worked for us decided they wanted it for themselves. They killed the others 3 days ago. My father and I ran. Now he's dead too, and I'm the only one left who knows where the claim is." Preston kept his back to her, his hands working mechanically at the saddle straps. "Take the deed to the land office. File the claim. Let the law handle it." "The law," she laughed, a bitter sound. "One of the men chasing me is Deputy Frank Morrison's brother. Who do you think the sheriff will believe? A woman with a wild story, or the brother of his own deputy?" That gave Preston pause. He knew Morrison, had dealt with the man on a few occasions in town. The deputy was lazy and corrupt, more interested in collecting bribes than enforcing justice. If his brother was involved in murder, Morrison would certainly look the other way. "Still not my problem," Preston said, but even to his own ears the words sounded less certain. "I have money," Hannah said desperately. "Not much, but I can pay you. Or the claim, I'll give you half of it, I don't care. I just need to survive long enough to—" She stopped abruptly, and Preston turned to see what had silenced her. 3 riders had appeared on the main road, moving slowly, their eyes scanning the landscape. Even from this distance, Preston could see they were armed and looking for something. Looking for her. He should have sent her away immediately. Should have pointed those men in her direction and washed his hands of the entire affair. Instead, he found himself moving, his body acting before his mind could catch up with his intentions. "Get in the cabin," he said quietly. "Move the wagon behind it, out of sight from the road. Do it now." Hannah did not waste time with thanks. She ran back to the wagon and climbed up, gathering the reins and urging the exhausted horses forward. Preston watched her guide the wagon around to the back of his cabin where it would be invisible from the road. Then he turned his attention back to the riders. They had stopped now, and one of them was pointing in his direction. After a moment's consultation, they began moving down the track toward his property. Preston waited on his porch, his posture relaxed but his mind calculating distances and angles. 3 men, all armed. If this turned into a gunfight, he was at a disadvantage. But perhaps it would not come to that. Perhaps they would simply ask their questions and leave. The riders pulled up in front of his cabin, and Preston studied them with the careful eye of a man who had seen his share of trouble. The leader was in his 40s, with a hard face and calculating eyes. The other 2 were younger, nervous, the kind of men who followed orders without thinking too much about right and wrong. "Morning," the leader said, his tone friendly enough, but Preston caught the steel beneath it. "Name's Douglas Kane. We're looking for someone, wondering if you might have seen her. Young woman, dark hair, driving a wagon, would have come past here in the last hour or so." "I mind my own business," Preston said. "Don't pay much attention to travelers." Kane's eyes narrowed slightly. "That's so. Seems like you'd notice a woman traveling alone. Not exactly a common sight out here." "Maybe she stayed on the main road," Preston suggested. "Plenty of other places she could have gone." One of the younger men spoke up, his voice edged with impatience. "We followed her tracks. They led this direction." Preston shrugged. "Desert wind blows tracks around. Easy to get turned around out here." Kane studied him for a long moment, and Preston could see the man weighing his options. Then Kane smiled, a cold expression that did not reach his eyes. "Mind if we take a look around?" "Just to be sure." "I do mind," Preston said evenly. "This is private property. You've got no cause to be here." "We've got cause if we say we do," the impatient young man said, starting to dismount. Preston's hand moved to his revolver in a smooth, practiced motion, and the young man froze. "I said you've got no cause," Preston repeated, his voice still quiet but carrying a weight that made all three men tense. "I've told you what I know, which is nothing. Now I suggest you move along before this gets unpleasant." Kane held up a hand, stopping his men from doing anything foolish. "No need for trouble, friend. We're just trying to find what belongs to us. The woman stole something valuable and we aim to get it back." "Like I said, haven't seen anyone," Preston replied. "You're wasting your time here." For a moment the standoff held, tension crackling in the air like heat lightning. Then Kane nodded slowly. "All right. But if you do see her, you'd be wise to tell her to give back what she took. Could save a lot of people a lot of trouble." He turned his horse and the other two followed, but not before the young man shot Preston a look of pure hatred. Preston watched them ride back toward the main road, but he noticed they did not continue west toward town. Instead, they took up positions at various points along the road where they could watch for anyone trying to pass. They were settling in for a siege, waiting for Hannah to make a run for it. Preston found her behind the cabin, tending to the exhausted horses. She had already unhitched them from the wagon and was offering them water from his trough. When she saw him, she straightened, her face anxious. "They're gone?" she asked. "They're waiting on the road," Preston said. "Set up to watch for you if you try to leave. They're not going to give up easy." Hannah closed her eyes briefly, and he saw her hands tremble before she clenched them into fists. "Thank you for not telling them I was here. I know you didn't want to get involved." "I'm still not involved," Preston said, more harshly than he intended. "But I'm not going to hand a woman over to killers. Soon as it's dark, you can slip out the back way, head north into the hills. They'll lose your trail in the rocks." "And then what?" Hannah asked, opening her eyes to look at him directly. "I go north, they follow eventually. I can't outrun them forever, and I can't go to the law. Sooner or later they'll find me." "Not my problem to solve," Preston said, turning away, but she followed him. "You could help me get to Prescott," she said. "The territorial capital. There's a judge there who knew my father who would listen to my story. With his help, I could file the claim properly, get protection. It's only a few days' ride." "No," Preston said flatly. He strode toward his cabin, but she kept pace with him, persistent despite everything. "Why?" she demanded. "Why won't you help? You clearly know how to handle yourself. You stood up to those men without flinching. A few days, that's all I'm asking." Preston spun to face her, and something in his expression must have been fierce because she took an involuntary step back. "Because I don't help people. I don't travel with people. I don't get involved in other people's problems. I came out here to be alone, and that's exactly how I intend to stay." "My father is dead," Hannah said, her voice breaking. "He died protecting me, buying me time to escape. If I die now, if those men catch me and kill me, then his death meant nothing. Is that what you want? To know you could have helped but chose not to? Preston felt anger rise in him, hot and familiar. You don't know anything about what I want. You came here uninvited, brought trouble to my door, and now you're trying to make me responsible for your survival. I'm not your father, I'm not your friend, I'm not anything to you. Find someone else to be your hero. He went inside and slammed the door, leaving her standing in his yard. For a long moment, he stood there in the dimness of his cabin, breathing hard, trying to push down the emotions her words had stirred up. He had built this life deliberately, chosen solitude over connection because connection meant vulnerability and vulnerability meant loss. He had lost enough for one lifetime. But as the afternoon wore on, and he tried to return to his normal routine, he found his thoughts drifting back to Hannah Bailey. She had made a small camp behind his cabin, far enough away to respect his demand for space, but close enough that he could see her if he looked out his back window. She sat with her knees drawn up, her arms wrapped around them, staring at nothing. She looked exhausted and lost and utterly alone. Preston tried to ignore her. He worked with his horses, mended his fence, prepared his dinner. But every time he glanced out the window, she was still there, and each time he felt that uncomfortable twist in his chest, that unwelcome reminder that he was not as dead inside as he had convinced himself. As dusk fell, he made a decision he knew he would regret. He fixed a second plate of food, simple fare of beans and cornbread, and carried it outside. Hannah looked up in surprise as he approached, and he saw hope flicker across her face before she carefully schooled her expression to neutrality. "Eat," he said gruffly, holding out the plate. "You'll need your strength if you're planning to travel tonight." She took the plate, her fingers briefly brushing his. "Thank you." He grunted and turned to leave, but her voice stopped him. "Preston James, right? That's what Gerald Thompson called you when I heard him talking about you in town last week. Said you were the best horseman he'd ever seen, but too stubborn and solitary for your own good." "Thompson talks too much," Preston muttered. "He also said you were at Shiloh," Hannah continued quietly. "Said you saw terrible things during the war. Is that why you live out here alone? Because you can't bear to be around people anymore?" Preston's jaw tightened. "Eat your food and mind your business." But Hannah was not done. "My father fought too, for the Union. He never talked about it much, but sometimes I would hear him wake up at night, gasping like he could not breathe. The things men saw in that war, the things they did, it changed them. I understand that." "You don't understand anything," Preston said coldly. "You're a woman who's had one bad thing happen to her. You think that makes you some kind of expert on suffering." Hannah's eyes flashed. "One bad thing. I've watched 5 men die in the past 3 days, including my father. I've been running for my life, knowing that if those men catch me, they'll do things far worse than just kill me. I'm alone, scared, and trying desperately to survive. So yes, maybe I do understand a little about suffering." The silence that followed was heavy with tension. Preston wanted to walk away, to retreat back into his cabin and his carefully maintained isolation. But something kept him rooted to the spot, some part of him that recognized the truth in her words. "I'll take you to Prescott," he said finally, the words coming out before he could stop them. "We leave at first light. 3 days, no more. I get you to the judge, make sure you're safe, then I come back here and you never contact me again. Those are my terms." Hannah's face transformed with relief and gratitude. "Yes, thank you. I agree to everything." Preston nodded curtly and walked back to his cabin, already questioning his sanity. 3 days, he told himself. He could endure 3 days of company. Then his life would return to normal, and Hannah Bailey would become nothing more than a brief interruption in his solitude. He had no idea how wrong he would be. They left before dawn, while the men watching the road were likely still half asleep. Preston had plotted a route that would take them north through rough terrain, avoiding the main roads entirely. Hannah rode one of her wagon horses while Preston took his bay gelding and led a pack horse carrying supplies. They had left the wagon hidden behind his cabin, its contents hastily divided between what was essential and what could be left behind. The first hours passed in silence. Preston set a steady pace, navigating through rocky arroyos and pine-covered hills with the confidence of a man who knew this land intimately. Hannah followed without complaint, though he could see the exhaustion in the set of her shoulders and the way she swayed slightly in the saddle when she thought he was not looking. By mid-morning, they had climbed high enough that Williams was nothing more than a distant smudge below them. Preston finally allowed them to stop near a small spring, letting the horses drink and rest. Hannah dismounted with a barely suppressed groan, and he noticed her wince as she stretched. "You're not used to riding," he observed. "Not for hours at a time, no," she admitted. "But I'll manage." Preston pulled jerky from his saddlebag and handed her a piece without comment. They ate standing up, both of them scanning the landscape behind them for any sign of pursuit. So far, they seemed to be clear, but Preston knew that could change quickly. "How did you end up prospecting with your father?" he asked, surprising himself with the question. He had not intended to make conversation, but the silence felt different now than the comfortable solitude he usually maintained. This silence felt heavy, weighted with all the things neither of them was saying. Hannah seemed equally surprised by his interest. "After my mother died 5 years ago, it was just the two of us. Father had always dreamed of finding gold, making a big strike. He sold everything we had in Missouri and headed west. We tried California first, but the easy claims were long gone. Then we heard about opportunities in Arizona territory, so we came here. Spent a year searching before we finally found something." "And you stayed with him the whole time?" Preston asked. "Most women would have found a safer situation." "Most women had somewhere else to go," Hannah said simply. "I didn't. Besides, my father needed me. He was a dreamer, not a practical man. Without me, he would have starved or been swindled within a month." Preston heard the affection in her voice and the grief beneath it. "How did it happen? Your father's death?" Hannah's expression shuddered, pain flickering across her face. "We were running. The men had found our camp, killed the workers we had hired. Father and I took 2 horses and rode. We thought we had gotten away, but they caught up to us yesterday morning. Father told me to keep going while he held them off. I heard the shot, but I did not stop. I could not stop." Her voice broke on the last word, and Preston saw tears tracking down her cheeks, though she made no sound. Something shifted in his chest, that carefully maintained wall developing a crack. He had spent 3 years avoiding this exact feeling, the empathy and connection that came from truly seeing another person's pain. "He made the right choice," Preston said quietly. "Gave you a chance to live. That's what any father would want." "But now I'm alone," Hannah whispered. "I have no one left." Preston had no answer for that. He knew what it was like to be alone, but his solitude was chosen. Hers was forced upon her, and that made all the difference. He mounted his horse again, signaling it was time to move on, and tried not to think about how familiar her loneliness felt. They traveled through the afternoon, climbing higher into the mountains. The landscape changed around them, desert scrub giving way to pine forests and rocky peaks. It was beautiful country, wild and untamed, and Preston found himself watching Hannah's reactions to it. She seemed to notice everything: the way the light filtered through the trees, the call of a hawk circling overhead, the smell of pine resin in the warm air. There was an openness to her, a willingness to find beauty even in the midst of fear and grief that he found both puzzling and oddly compelling. As evening approached, they made camp in a small clearing surrounded by tall ponderosas. Preston tended to the horses while Hannah gathered firewood, moving with practiced efficiency despite her obvious exhaustion. They worked in parallel silence, each focused on their tasks, but it felt less lonely than Preston was used to. Less empty. When the fire was lit and coffee was brewing, they sat on opposite sides of the flames. Hannah had pulled her dark hair back in a simple braid, and in the firelight, Preston could see the delicate structure of her face, the strength in her jaw and the intelligence in her eyes. She was pretty, he realized with some discomfort, though that was a detail he had no business noticing. "You never said why you came out here," Hannah said after a while. "To Arizona, I mean. Why this place specifically?" Preston stared into the fire, debating how much to tell her. "Needed somewhere empty," he said finally. "Somewhere I could breathe. Because of the war. Because of a lot of things." He did not elaborate, and for a moment he thought she would press the issue. But Hannah simply nodded, accepting his reticence. "I think the empty places are the hardest," she said softly. "After my mother died, our house felt so empty I could barely stand to be in it. Every room reminded me that she was gone. At least with prospecting, we were always moving, always doing something. It was easier than sitting still with the grief." Preston understood that instinct more than he cared to admit. He had been running too in his own way, though he had convinced himself that what he was doing was standing still. "What will you do after?" he asked. "After you file the claim and deal with the law." Hannah was quiet for a long moment, staring into her coffee cup. "I don't know," she admitted. "I've never really thought about a future beyond surviving the present. Maybe I'll work the claim, hire honest workers, see what my father died protecting. Or maybe I'll sell it and start over somewhere else. What about you?" "I'll go back to my cabin," Preston said. "Go back to my life." "Doesn't it get lonely?" Hannah asked, and there was no judgment in her voice, only genuine curiosity. "Living out there by yourself, never talking to anyone." "Lonely is safe," Preston said, the words coming out more honestly than he intended. "Lonely means no one else gets hurt." Hannah looked at him across the fire, and he saw understanding in her eyes. "Who did you lose?" Preston's first instinct was to shut down the conversation, to retreat behind the walls he had built. But something about the night, the isolation, the fact that this woman would be gone from his life in a few days, loosened his tongue. "My brother," he said quietly. "Younger than me by 2 years. We fought together at Shiloh. I was supposed to watch his back, keep him safe. But the fighting was so chaotic, so loud and confused, I lost track of him in the smoke. Found him 3 hours later, dying in a field hospital. He held on long enough to make me promise I would survive, that I would live enough for both of us. Then he was gone." The memory was as sharp as ever, despite the years. He could still see Matthew's face, pale with blood loss, still hear his labored breathing and the rattle in his chest. The guilt had lived in Preston ever since, a constant weight pressing on his chest. "I'm sorry," Hannah said, and the simple sincerity in her voice made something ache in him. "But pushing everyone away, living in isolation, that's not living. That's just existing. I don't think your brother would have wanted that for you." "You didn't know my brother," Preston said, but there was no heat in his words. "No, but I knew my mother," Hannah replied. "And when she was dying, the last thing she told me was not to let grief make me small. She said life was meant to be lived in connection with others, that joy and pain were 2 sides of the same coin, and you could not have one without risking the other. I think she was right." Preston had no answer for that. He finished his coffee in silence and then stood, moving to check on the horses one final time before bed. But as he worked, he found himself thinking about Hannah's words, about connection and risk and whether the life he had built was really living at all. The next day brought harder terrain and slower progress. They navigated narrow trails that hugged cliff faces, forded cold streams swollen with snowmelt from the high peaks, and picked their way through boulder fields where one wrong step could lame a horse. Preston watched Hannah constantly, ready to help if she faltered, but she proved surprisingly capable. Whatever softness her appearance suggested was belied by a core of steel he was coming to respect. They stopped for a brief rest at midday, and Preston found himself asking about the claim, about what her father had found. Hannah pulled a worn leather pouch from inside her shirt and opened it carefully. Inside was a chunk of rock shot through with veins of gold that glittered even in the shaded light. "It's a good strike," she said. "Not just surface gold, but a real vein. My father estimated there could be thousands of dollars worth, maybe more, enough to change someone's life." "Enough to kill for," Preston observed. "Yes." Hannah tucked the pouch away again, her expression troubled. "I keep thinking about the men who worked for us. They seemed decent enough at first, but when they saw how much gold there was, something changed in them. They started looking at my father differently, started talking in whispers when they thought we could not hear. Father noticed it too. He was planning to go to Williams to file the claim and hire different workers, but they moved faster than we expected. Greed makes men stupid," Preston said. "And dangerous. Have you ever been tempted?" Hannah asked. "You know I'm carrying that pouch. You could take it, file the claim yourself. I could not stop you." Preston met her eyes, seeing the test in the question. "I've got no interest in gold or the trouble it brings. I already have what I need." "Which is peace," Preston said simply, "or as close to it as a man can get." Hannah studied him for a moment, then nodded. "I believe you," she said, and he was surprised by how much her trust meant to him. They pushed on through the afternoon, making better time now that they had descended into a valley where the terrain was more forgiving. Preston was just beginning to think they would make it to Prescott without incident when he heard the sound that made his blood run cold, the distant thunder of multiple horses moving fast. He reined in immediately, holding up a hand to signal Hannah to stop. They both sat frozen, listening. The sound was coming from behind them, perhaps half a mile back and closing fast. Preston cursed under his breath. Somehow, Kane and his men had picked up their trail. "How many?" Hannah asked, her voice tight with fear. "4, maybe 5, Preston estimated. "More than we can fight." He scanned the landscape around them rapidly, his mind working through their limited options. They were in a valley with steep sides, pinned between rock walls that would take too long to climb. Ahead, the valley narrowed before opening up again, and Preston remembered this place from previous travels. There was a side canyon, barely visible unless you knew to look for it, that could provide cover. It was a risk, but they were out of better choices. "This way," he said, spurring his horse forward. "Stay close." They rode hard, the pack horse struggling to keep pace. Behind them, the sound of pursuit grew louder. Preston could hear shouting now, which meant Kane's men had spotted them. He urged his horse faster, ignoring the danger of the rocky ground, focused entirely on reaching that side canyon before they were overtaken. The entrance appeared suddenly, a narrow gap between two rock walls that looked like nothing more than a shadow. Preston guided his horse through without slowing, trusting it to find its footing in the dim light. Hannah followed, the walls of the canyon so close that her legs nearly scraped the stone. The pack horse balked at the entrance, precious seconds ticking by as Preston dismounted and led it through by force. Inside, the canyon opened up slightly, though it remained narrow enough that the high walls blocked most of the sunlight. Preston kept moving, leading them deeper into the maze of rock, taking turns he remembered from years ago when he had explored this area. Behind them, he heard horses pulling up at the canyon entrance, heard angry voices arguing about whether to follow. "This could be a trap," one voice said. "Then we spring it," Kane replied. "I'm not letting that woman slip away again. We've come too far." Preston heard the sound of horses entering the canyon and knew they had only moments. He spotted what he was looking for, a narrow cleft in the rock wall barely wide enough for a man to squeeze through, let alone a horse. It was their only chance. "Get down," he whispered to Hannah. "We're going on foot." They dismounted quickly, and Preston led the horses to the cleft. Beyond it, hidden from view of the main canyon, was a small enclosed space where the animals could be concealed. It was tight work getting them through, and the pack horse balked again, but finally all three animals were hidden. Preston and Hannah squeezed through after them, pressing themselves against the rock wall just as Kane and his men rode past their position. "They came this way," one of the men said, his voice echoing off the canyon walls. "Tracks are fresh. Split up," Kane ordered. "Check every side passage." "They can't have gone far." Preston heard the men separate, their horses moving in different directions. He and Hannah stood perfectly still, barely breathing, pressed so close together that he could feel the rapid beating of her heart. Minutes crawled by like hours. One of the men rode past their hiding spot twice, so close that Preston could have reached out and touched the horse's flank. But the entrance was too well concealed, just a shadow among shadows, and the rider moved on without noticing. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Kane called his men back. "This place is a maze," he said, frustration clear in his voice. "We could spend hours searching and find nothing. They might not have even come this way, might have doubled back while we were following false trails." "So we give up?" one of the younger men asked. "We regroup," Kane said. "Head to Prescott and watch the roads there. They're heading for the capital, has to be. We'll catch them when they arrive." The sound of horses retreating gradually faded, and still Preston waited, counting to 100 and then another 100 before he allowed himself to relax. Hannah sagged against the rock wall, her legs shaking with released tension. "That was too close," she whispered. Preston nodded, moving to check on the horses. They were spooked but unharmed. He led them out of the cleft one at a time, then helped Hannah remount. The sun was getting low now, painting the canyon walls in shades of orange and red. "We'll camp here tonight," he said. "Can't risk traveling in the dark, not through terrain like this." They found a sheltered spot deeper in the canyon where a small spring provided water. There was no question of building a fire, not when Kane's men might still be close enough to see the smoke or light. They ate cold rations in the darkness, sitting close together for warmth as the temperature dropped. "Thank you," Hannah said softly. "You saved my life today, again." Preston shrugged, uncomfortable with her gratitude. "Just doing what needed to be done." "No, it's more than that," Hannah insisted. "You could have told those men where I was that first day. You could have refused to take me to Prescott. You could have ridden away just now and saved yourself. But you didn't. You keep choosing to help me, even though I know it goes against your nature." "Maybe I'm just too stubborn to let Kane win," Preston said, deflecting. Hannah was quiet for a moment, and when she spoke again, her voice was thoughtful. "I don't think that's it. I think underneath all that isolation and gruffness, you're a good man who still cares about people, even though you pretend not to." Preston wanted to argue, but the words stuck in his throat, because perhaps she was right. Perhaps underneath all the walls and defenses, some part of him still remembered what it was like to care, to connect, to be part of something larger than himself. The realization was uncomfortable, threatening to the life he had built, but also somehow warm, like sun on his face after a long winter. They sat in silence after that, shoulders touching in the darkness. Eventually, Hannah's breathing evened out as exhaustion claimed her, and she slumped against him in sleep. Preston remained awake, keeping watch, very aware of her weight against his side. It had been years since he had been this close to another person, years since he had let anyone past his defenses. And while part of him wanted to pull away, to re-establish the distance he relied on, another part found a strange comfort in her presence. The stars wheeled overhead, bright and countless in the clear mountain air. Preston watched them and tried not to think about what would happen in Prescott when his obligation to Hannah ended and he had to return to his solitary life. Tried not to acknowledge the small but growing fear that solitude would feel more like loneliness now that he had remembered what companionship could be. Morning brought crisp air and the challenge of navigating out of the canyon system. Preston took his time, checking each turn before committing to it, making sure they were not riding into an ambush. But Kane's men seemed to have truly left, and by mid-morning they had emerged from the canyons onto a high plateau that offered clear views in all directions. Prescott was less than a day's ride ahead now, and Preston felt an unexpected heaviness at the thought. This journey was almost over. Soon Hannah would be safe, and he would ride back to Williams alone. That was what he wanted, what he had always wanted. But it felt different now, less like a return to peace and more like an ending. They stopped to rest the horses and ate a quick meal. Hannah seemed quieter today, more withdrawn. Preston wondered if she was thinking the same thoughts he was, contemplating what came next. "Preston," she said suddenly, and something in her tone made him look up. "I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer me honestly." He waited, wary of where this might be going. "These past few days, traveling with you, has it been as terrible as you expected?" she asked. "When you agreed to help me, you looked like you were accepting a death sentence. But has it really been that bad?" Preston considered the question carefully. Honesty seemed important, though he was not sure why. "No," he admitted finally. "It hasn't been terrible. Has any part of it been good?" She pressed. "Even a little bit." He met her eyes, seeing the vulnerability in them, the hope. "Some parts," he said quietly. "Some parts have been better than I expected." Hannah smiled, a tentative expression that transformed her face. "I'm glad. Because for me, despite everything, despite the fear and the danger and the grief, these have also been some of the best days I've had in a long time. I haven't felt alone. That matters more than I can say." Preston felt something shift in his chest, that crack in his walls widening. "Hannah, I know what you're going to say," she interrupted. "That this is temporary, that you're going back to your life and I'm going on to mine. I know that. But I want you to know that you've given me something important. You've reminded me that there are still good people in the world, people worth trusting. So thank you for that." They rode on in silence, but something had changed between them. Preston found himself watching Hannah more openly now, noticing the way she sat her horse, the play of sunlight in her dark hair, the strength and grace in her movements. He found himself imagining what it would be like if this journey did not end, if they just kept riding together into some undefined future. The thought should have terrified him. Instead, it felt almost comfortable, like a coat he had forgotten he owned. By late afternoon, Prescott appeared in the distance, a sprawling town nestled in a valley between pine-covered hills. It was considerably larger than Williams, the territorial capital bustling with activity even from a distance. Preston felt his stomach tighten as they approached. This was it, the end of their journey. They rode through the outskirts of town, past mining operations and freight yards, into streets crowded with wagons and pedestrians. Hannah looked around with wide eyes, overwhelmed by the noise and activity after days in the wilderness. Preston led them directly to the courthouse, a substantial adobe building in the town center. Judge Marcus Henley, Hannah said, reading the name from a plaque outside. That's who my father wanted me to see. He and Father worked together years ago before Father came west. They dismounted and tied their horses. Preston checked his revolver out of habit, then followed Hannah inside. The building was cooler than the street, with high ceilings and thick walls. A clerk directed them to Judge Henley's chambers on the second floor. The judge was a man in his 60s with shrewd eyes and a kind face. When Hannah gave her name, his expression shifted immediately to concern. "Hannah Bailey," he said, standing up from his desk. "I heard about your father's death. A prospector brought news to town yesterday. I'm so very sorry." Hannah's composure cracked slightly. "You heard already, just that Cornelius was killed, no details," Henley said. "Please sit down, both of you, tell me everything." For the next hour, Hannah recounted the entire story. The gold strike, the murder of their workers, the flight from Kane and his men, her father's death. She showed Henley the claim deed and the sample of gold ore. Preston watched the judge's face as he listened, saw the anger and determination there. "Douglas Kane," Henley said when Hannah finished. "I know of him. He's been causing trouble in the territory for years, but he's slippery, hard to pin down. And you say Deputy Morrison's brother is involved." "William Morrison," Hannah confirmed. "He was one of the men chasing us." Henley nodded grimly. "That complicates matters, but it doesn't change what needs to be done. I'll file your claim immediately and send telegrams to the territorial governor and the federal marshal. With the proper authorities involved, Kane won't be able to touch you or your claim." Relief washed over Hannah's face so strongly that Preston felt it resonate in his own chest. "Thank you," she said. "Thank you so much." "Where are you staying?" Henley asked. "I want to make sure you're safe while we sort this out." "We just arrived," Hannah admitted. "I haven't thought that far ahead. There's a good boarding house 2 streets over, run by a widow named Martha Crawford," Henley said. "I'll write you a note of introduction. She's trustworthy and her establishment is respectable. I'd also like to assign you a guard just as a precaution." As Henley wrote the note, Preston felt that heaviness returned stronger now. This was where he was supposed to say goodbye to fulfill his promise and ride away. Hannah was safe now, or as safe as she could be. His obligation was complete. "Preston," Hannah said softly, turning to him. "Will you stay? At least for tonight? I know you want to get back, but I'd feel better if—" "I'll stay," he said before he could talk himself out of it. "Make sure you're settled." They left the courthouse with Henley's note and directions to the boarding house. The sun was setting now, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. Preston led the way through the streets, Hannah walking beside him, neither of them speaking. The boarding house was a neat 2-story structure with a welcoming porch. Martha Crawford turned out to be a warm woman in her 50s who took one look at Hannah's exhausted face and immediately bustled her inside. "You look like you need a hot meal and a proper bed," she said. "Come with me, dear." Preston stayed behind on the porch, suddenly uncertain of his place. But Hannah turned back before following Mrs. Crawford. "You'll come in, won't you?" she asked. "Stay for dinner at least." He should have said no. Should have made his excuses and ridden out of town before he got any more tangled up in her life. But instead he found himself nodding and following them inside. Mrs. Crawford showed Hannah to a room and offered Preston a place to wash up. When they gathered for dinner an hour later, there were several other boarders at the table, a mix of miners, merchants, and a schoolteacher. The conversation was lively, but Preston mostly listened, content to observe. He noticed how Hannah gradually relaxed, how the tension that had been her constant companion for days slowly began to ease. She laughed at something the schoolteacher said, and the sound made something warm unfurl in Preston's chest. After dinner, Mrs. Crawford insisted Preston take a room for the night, refusing payment when he tried to offer it. "Judge Henley's note says you helped this young woman when she needed it most," she said firmly. "That makes you a guest of honor in this house." Preston found himself installed in a small but comfortable room down the hall from Hannah's. As night fell, he sat on the bed, listening to the sounds of the boarding house settling down for sleep. This was it. Tomorrow he would ride back to Williams. Tomorrow his life would return to normal, but the thought brought no comfort. Instead, he felt a restlessness he had not experienced in years, a sense that something important was slipping through his fingers. A soft knock on his door interrupted his thoughts. When he opened it, Hannah stood in the hallway, wearing a simple nightdress with a shawl wrapped around her shoulders. "I couldn't sleep," she said. "Can we talk?" Preston hesitated, then stepped aside to let her in. She moved to the window, looking out at the moonlit street below. "I've been thinking about tomorrow," she said quietly, "about you leaving." "That was always the plan," Preston said. "I know, but I want to ask you something." She turned to face him, her expression serious. "What if you didn't go back? What if you stayed, helped me work the claim?" "I meant what I said about sharing it. Half of everything would be yours. We could be partners." Preston felt his walls slamming back into place, an automatic defensive response. "I don't want your gold." "I'm not talking about gold," Hannah said, taking a step closer. "I'm talking about companionship. Partnership. These past few days, I've seen who you are underneath all that isolation. You're strong and capable and good. You say you want to be alone, but I don't think that's true. I think you're scared of being hurt again, scared of caring about someone and losing them. But Preston, isn't that fear worse than the fear of actually living?" "You don't understand," Preston said, his voice strained. "Everyone I care about ends up dead or damaged. My brother, men I fought with, people I tried to protect. I'm poison to people who get close to me." "That's grief talking, not truth," Hannah said gently. She moved closer still until she was standing right in front of him. "What happened to your brother wasn't your fault. What happened to those men in the war wasn't your fault. Bad things happen in this world, Preston. People die. But that doesn't mean we should stop living, stop connecting, stop caring." Preston wanted to argue, to push her away, to defend the walls he had built around himself. But looking into her eyes, seeing the hope and warmth there, he felt those walls crumbling. When had she become so important to him? When had the thought of riding away alone become painful instead of peaceful? "I don't know how to do this," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "I've been alone so long, I don't remember how to be any other way." "You remembered over the past 3 days," Hannah said. "You talked with me, traveled with me, protected me. You were connected to another person, Preston. You just have to decide if you want that to continue." She reached up and touched his face, her hand gentle against his bearded cheek. Preston closed his eyes, overwhelmed by the contact, by the tenderness in her touch. How long had it been since anyone had touched him with kindness? How long since he had allowed it? "Stay," Hannah whispered. "Please. Not for the gold or the claim. Stay for me. Stay because I think you're as tired of being alone as I am." Preston opened his eyes and looked at her, really looked at her. He saw her strength and her vulnerability, her courage and her need. He saw someone who had been through terrible things, but had not let them destroy her capacity for hope. And he realized with a shock that ran through his entire body that somewhere in the past 3 days, he had fallen for her. Despite his best efforts, despite all his careful defenses, Hannah Bailey had gotten past them all. "I'm not good at this," he said. "I'll mess it up. I'll be difficult and stubborn and probably hurt you without meaning to." "I know," Hannah said, smiling through tears. "But I think you're worth the trouble. And I think maybe I'm worth taking a chance on too." Preston made a decision that terrified and thrilled him in equal measure. He pulled Hannah into his arms, holding her tightly, feeling her warmth and solidity against him. She wrapped her arms around his waist, her head against his chest, and they stood there in the moonlight streaming through the window, two lonely people finding unexpected comfort in each other. "I'll stay," he said into her hair. "I'll try, that's all I can promise." "That's enough," Hannah said. "That's more than enough." They stood there for a long time, neither wanting to let go. Eventually, Preston walked her back to her room, but at her door she pulled him down for a kiss. It was tentative at first, both of them out of practice and uncertain. But then it deepened, becoming something real and alive, a promise of things to come. When they finally pulled apart, both were breathing hard. "Good night, Preston," Hannah said softly. "Good night," he managed, then watched her slip inside her room before returning to his own. He lay awake for hours, his mind racing. He had just committed to something he had sworn he would never do again, opened himself up to another person, made himself vulnerable to loss. It was terrifying. But underneath, the fear was something else, something warm and hopeful that he had thought long dead. Maybe Hannah was right. Maybe hiding from life was not the same as living it. Maybe it was time to take a chance on something other than solitude. The next morning brought new challenges and unexpected complications. Preston woke to find Hannah already up and dressed, talking urgently with Mrs. Crawford in the front room. When he joined them, he saw the worry on both their faces. "What's wrong?" he asked. "Judge Henley sent a message," Hannah said. "Douglas Kane is in Prescott. He must have ridden straight through the night after losing us in the canyons. He's stirring up trouble, claiming that I stole the claim from him, that my father owed him money. He's got witnesses backing his story, men willing to lie for him." Preston felt anger rise hot and fast. "Can he do that? Challenge the claim? He can try," Mrs. Crawford said grimly. "And with enough lies and enough money to spread around, he might even succeed. The law is one thing, but public opinion is another." "We need to get back to Judge Henley," Preston said. "Figure out our next move." They walked to the courthouse together, Preston hyper-aware of their surroundings, watching for any sign of Kane or his men. Prescott felt different this morning, the friendly bustle of yesterday replaced by an undercurrent of tension. They found Judge Henley in his chambers, looking troubled. "I'm glad you're here," he said when they entered. "We have a problem. Kane has filed a competing claim, saying your father entered into a partnership with him before his death. He's got paperwork that looks legitimate, though I suspect it's forged." "It's absolutely forged," Hannah said angrily. "My father would never have partnered with Kane. He didn't trust the man." "I believe you," Henley said. "But Kane is good at this sort of thing. He's manipulated the system before. What we need is proof that his documents are false or testimony from someone who can contradict his story." "What about the men who worked for us?" Hannah asked. "The ones Kane killed." "Surely someone saw something, knows something." "Dead men don't testify," Henley said grimly. "And Kane made sure there were no witnesses. It's your word against his and his bought testimony." Preston had been listening carefully, his mind working through the problem. "What if we could prove Kane's men killed those prospectors? That would discredit him, make his claim worthless." "We'd need evidence," Henley said. "Something concrete." "The site," Hannah said suddenly. "The claim site where the workers were killed. There might be something there, some evidence we could use." "It's a 2-day ride back," Preston said, "and Kane would be watching for us to go there." "But if we could get there without being seen, if we could find something," Hannah said, her excitement growing, "it could change everything." Henley considered this, then nodded slowly. "It's risky, but it might be our best option. I can stall the claim hearing for a few days, say we're waiting for documents from the land office in Williams. That would give you time to get there and back. Preston did not like it. Going back into territory where Kane and his men were actively searching for them was dangerous. But he also saw the determination in Hannah's face and knew she would go with or without him. At least if he went with her, he could try to keep her safe. "We'll need supplies," he said. "And we'll need to be careful. Kane will have men watching the roads." They spent the rest of the morning preparing. Judge Henley arranged for supplies and fresh horses, refusing to let them use their exhausted mounts from the journey to Prescott. He also provided a letter of authority, making it clear that they were acting under his direction. Preston checked his weapons carefully and purchased extra ammunition. By early afternoon, they were ready to leave. Mrs. Crawford packed them food and made them promise to be careful. Judge Henley pulled Preston aside before they mounted. "Take care of her," the judge said quietly. "Cornelius was a good man, and his daughter deserves better than the hand she's been dealt." "I will," Preston promised, surprised by how much he meant it. They rode out of Prescott, heading west, then circled north once they were out of sight of town, using the tactics Preston had learned during the war to hide their trail. The claim site was in the mountains north of Williams, a hard 2 days' ride through rough country. They pushed hard that first day, stopping only briefly to rest the horses. As night fell, they made camp in a dense pine forest that offered good concealment. Preston built a small fire, just enough for coffee and warmth, while Hannah tended to the horses. When they finally sat down to eat, exhaustion was written on both their faces. "Are you having second thoughts?" Hannah asked. "About staying, I mean, about trying to make this work." Preston looked at her across the fire, at the way the light caught in her eyes, the determined set of her jaw despite her obvious fatigue. "No second thoughts," he said. "Are you, now that you've had time to think about it?" "None," Hannah said firmly. "I meant what I said. I think we could be good together, Preston. I think we could build something real." "Your father might not have approved," Preston said. "A broken-down ex-soldier with more ghosts than future." "My father would have liked you," Hannah said with quiet certainty. "He always said character mattered more than circumstances. And you have character, Preston James. You just hide it well." Preston felt warmth spread through his chest, a feeling so unfamiliar it took him a moment to recognize it as happiness. "I want to try," he said. "Really try. Not just with the claim, but with everything. With you." Hannah smiled, and in that moment she was the most beautiful thing Preston had ever seen. "That's all I'm asking for, a real chance for both of us." They finished their meal in comfortable silence, then banked the fire for the night. Preston set up their bedrolls close together, and when they lay down, Hannah reached over and took his hand. They fell asleep like that, fingers intertwined, two people who had been alone too long finding comfort in connection. The second day brought them into the high mountains where Cornelius Bailey had made his strike. Hannah guided them now, following landmarks she remembered. They moved cautiously, aware that Kane's men might still be in the area. By late afternoon, they had reached the claim site. It was immediately obvious that something violent had happened here. The small camp was destroyed, tents slashed and supplies scattered. There were dark stains on the ground that Preston recognized as old blood. Hannah dismounted slowly, her face pale as she took in the destruction. "This is where it happened," she said quietly. "Where they killed our workers." Preston moved through the campsite carefully, looking for anything that might serve as evidence. Most of the camp's contents were ruined or stolen, but near what had been the cook tent, he found something interesting. A knife with initials carved into the handle. "W.M. William Morrison, Hannah," he called. "Look at this." She came over and examined the knife, then nodded slowly. "That's Morrison's. I remember seeing him with it. He was always playing with it, flipping it through his fingers." It was not much, but it was something, a direct link between Morrison and the murder site. Preston wrapped the knife carefully in cloth and tucked it into his saddlebag. They continued searching, finding a few more items that had belonged to Kane's men, enough to establish their presence at the site. "Let's check the mine itself," Hannah said, pointing to a rough entrance dug into the side of the mountain. "My father kept records there in a metal box. If Kane didn't find it, it might have information we could use." They lit a lamp and entered the mine carefully. It was not very deep, maybe 50 feet, but the vein of gold was clearly visible in the rock walls. Near the back, Hannah found what she was looking for, a metal box hidden beneath loose stones. Inside were her father's careful notes, documenting the discovery, the hiring of workers, and most importantly, his suspicions about Kane's interest in the claim. "Father knew Kane was planning something," Hannah said, reading through the notes. "He wrote about it here, about how Kane had approached him trying to buy in as a partner. Father refused, and that's when things started going wrong. Workers reporting strange men watching the camp, supplies going missing. It was the evidence they needed, testimony from beyond the grave that would contradict Kane's claims." Preston felt relief wash over him, followed quickly by caution. "We need to get this back to Prescott." "But Kane's men might be—" He did not finish the sentence, because at that moment he heard it, the unmistakable sound of horses approaching the camp. Preston grabbed Hannah's arm and pulled her deeper into the mine, extinguishing the lamp. In the sudden darkness, they stood frozen, listening. "Someone's been here," a voice called from outside. Preston recognized it as Kane's. "Tracks are fresh. Search the area." They were trapped. The mine only had one entrance, and Kane's men were between them and freedom. Preston's mind raced through options. They could wait and hope the men did not search the mine, but that was a gamble. They could try to fight their way out, but they were outnumbered. Or they could go deeper into the mine and hope there was another way out. "Is there any other exit?" he whispered to Hannah. "I don't know," she breathed back. "Father never mentioned one." They had no choice but to move deeper into the darkness, feeling their way along the rough walls. Behind them, Preston heard someone enter the mine. Light flickered against the walls as whoever it was carried a torch. They kept moving, the passage narrowing until they had to turn sideways to squeeze through. Preston's heart hammered in his chest. If this passage dead ended, they were finished. Then Hannah gasped softly. "I feel air moving. There might be an opening." They pushed forward with renewed urgency, following the faint current of fresh air. The passage twisted and turned, getting narrower and more treacherous. Behind them, the light grew brighter as more men entered the mine. Voices echoed off the walls, making it impossible to tell how close their pursuers were. Finally, when Preston was beginning to think they would be caught after all, the passage opened up slightly and he saw it. A narrow shaft angling upward, moonlight visible far above. It was barely wide enough for a person to climb, and it would be a difficult ascent, but it was a way out. "You first," he told Hannah, helping her into the shaft. She began climbing, her feet and hands finding purchase on the rough rock. Preston followed, the metal box containing Cornelius Bailey's notes strapped to his back. Behind and below them, he heard the shout as Kane's men discovered the passage they had taken. The climb was brutal. The shaft was almost vertical in places, and twice Hannah nearly fell before Preston caught her. His muscles burned with the effort, and his hands were soon raw and bleeding from gripping the sharp rock. But finally, after what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, Hannah pulled herself out onto the mountainside above the mine. Preston followed seconds later, rolling onto solid ground and gasping for air. They had emerged on a steep slope above the claim site. Below, they could see Kane's men gathered at the mine entrance, arguing about whether to follow up the shaft. In the moonlight, Preston could also see their horses, still tied where they had left them, unguarded in the confusion. "We need to get to the horses," he said, "while they're distracted." They half climbed, half slid down the slope, using the darkness and chaos as cover. By the time Kane's men realized what was happening, Preston and Hannah were mounted and riding hard into the night. Shots rang out behind them, but in the darkness, the shooters were firing blind. Preston led them along a route he had scouted in his mind during their approach, knowing that their only chance was to put distance between themselves and pursuit before dawn. They rode through the night without stopping, pushing the horses as hard as they dared. By dawn, they had put miles between themselves and the claim site, and there was no sign of immediate pursuit. They finally stopped near a stream to let the horses rest and drink. Hannah dismounted shakily, the fear and exhaustion of the night finally catching up to her. Preston caught her as her knees gave out and she clung to him, trembling. "We made it," he said quietly. "We're safe." "For now," Hannah said. "But Kane knows we have evidence now. He'll be desperate." "Good," Preston said grimly. "Desperate men make mistakes." They rested for an hour, then continued south toward Prescott. The journey back took a day and a half of hard riding, stopping only when absolutely necessary. By the time Prescott came into view, both of them were swaying in their saddles with exhaustion. Judge Henley was waiting for them at his office, having received word from his contacts that there had been activity at the claim site. When Preston and Hannah presented him with the knife and Cornelius Bailey's notes, the judge's face lit up with satisfaction. "This is exactly what we need," he said, reading through the notes. Bailey documented everything, including dates that contradict Kane's fake partnership agreement. Combined with Morrison's knife, we can prove they were at the scene of the murders. I'll have warrants issued immediately. The hearing took place 2 days later. Preston sat beside Hannah in the courthouse, watching as Judge Henley systematically destroyed Kane's claims. The knife, the notes, testimony about the timing of events, all of it painted a clear picture of murder and attempted claim theft. Kane's bought witnesses crumbled under Henley's questioning, their stories falling apart. When it was over, Kane was arrested along with William Morrison and the other men who had participated in the murders. Deputy Morrison from Williams was suspended pending investigation into whether he had aided his brother. Hannah's claim was confirmed and filed properly. She now legally owned one of the richest gold strikes in the territory. After the hearing, as they walked out of the courthouse, Hannah stopped and looked up at Preston. "We did it," she said wonderingly. "It's really over." "It's over," Preston confirmed. "You're safe now and rich, probably." Hannah laughed, but there was something uncertain in her eyes. "About that, about the claim, I meant what I said about splitting it. Half is yours if you still want to stay and work it with me." Preston looked down at this remarkable woman who had tumbled into his life and changed everything. "I don't want the gold," he said, "but I want to stay." "If the offer's still open." "The offer is definitely still open," Hannah said, her face transforming with joy. "But what do you want if not the claim?" Preston took both her hands in his, right there in the street with people walking past and the sun warm on their faces. "I want to try building a life with you. I want to wake up in the morning and have someone to share coffee with. I want to work hard during the day and have someone to come home to at night. I want to remember what it's like to be part of something bigger than myself." Hannah's eyes were bright with tears. "That sounds perfect. That sounds like everything I want too." Preston pulled her close and kissed her, not caring who saw, not caring about anything except this woman and this moment and the future they were going to build together. When they finally broke apart, both were grinning like fools. "So what do we do now?" Hannah asked. "Hire workers for the claim. Start mining, eventually," Preston said. "But first, I think we should go back to Williams. I need to settle things at my cabin, and we need to decide where we're going to live. Together." The word "together" still felt strange on his tongue, but also right in a way that nothing had felt right in years. They spent another week in Prescott, making arrangements. Hannah hired a lawyer to handle the claim paperwork and to oversee the hiring of workers. She arranged for a percentage of the profits to go to the families of the men who had been killed, a gesture that made Preston respect her even more. They bought supplies and made plans, talking late into the night about what they wanted their future to look like. Finally, they were ready to return to Williams. The ride back was completely different from their frantic journey north. This time they traveled at a leisurely pace, stopping to admire the scenery, talking about everything and nothing. Preston found himself telling Hannah stories from before the war, memories of his childhood in Tennessee that he had not thought about in years. In turn, she told him about her life in Missouri, about her mother and the dreams her father had chased across the West. When they reached Preston's cabin outside Williams, Hannah looked at it with interest. It was small and austere, reflecting the stark simplicity of Preston's life there. But she did not criticize or suggest changes. Instead, she simply said, "It must have been very peaceful here." "It was," Preston admitted, "but it was also lonely, even though I didn't want to admit it." They decided to keep the cabin but also to build a larger house near the claim site where they would spend most of their time. Preston would maintain his horse training business, while Hannah would oversee the mining operation. It would be a partnership in every sense, both of them contributing their strengths. The weeks that followed were full of activity. They hired a crew of workers, men carefully vetted by Judge Henley to ensure they were honest and trustworthy. They began construction on a house near the claim, a simple but sturdy structure that would serve as both home and office. Preston found himself enjoying the bustle and noise, the sense of purpose that came from building something with someone else. But more than the work, he treasured the quiet moments. Morning coffee shared on the porch of his cabin while they watched the sun rise. Evening walks through the pine forests, Hannah's hand in his. Late-night conversations by the fire about dreams and fears and hopes for the future. He was learning how to be close to someone again, how to lower his walls and let another person in. It was not always easy. Sometimes he would feel the old instinct to retreat, to push her away before she could hurt him or be hurt by him. But Hannah was patient, giving him space when he needed it and gently calling him back when he went too far. Summer turned to fall, the aspens in the high country blazing gold and orange. The mine was producing well, exceeding even the optimistic estimates. Money was coming in, more money than either Preston or Hannah knew what to do with. They paid the workers generously, invested in better equipment, and saved the rest, neither of them interested in frivolous spending. One evening in late October, as they sat on the porch of their still unfinished house, Preston turned to Hannah and said, "Marry me." It was not romantic or poetic. He did not get down on one knee or produce a ring. But the words came from somewhere deep and true, from that place in him that she had awakened. Hannah looked at him, her face glowing in the light of the setting sun. "Yes," she said simply. "Yes, I'll marry you." They were married in November in Williams, with Judge Henley traveling from Prescott to perform the ceremony. It was a small affair, just a few people from town who had gotten to know Preston and Hannah over the past months. Mrs. Crawford came from Prescott and cried through the whole ceremony. Gerald Thompson gave them a pair of horses as a wedding gift, young stock from his own herd. After the wedding, they returned to their house, finally completed and furnished simply but comfortably. That night, lying in their bed with Hannah in his arms, Preston felt a peace he had not known since before the war. The ghosts were still there, would always be there, but they seemed quieter now, less demanding. He had found something to balance them, something light to weigh against the darkness. "Are you happy?" Hannah asked softly, her head on his chest. "Yes," Preston said, surprised by how true it was. "I think I am." "Good," she said, "because I am too. More than I ever thought I could be again." Winter came to the mountains, bringing snow and cold that shut down the mining operation for months. But Preston and Hannah did not mind. They had time together, time to settle into married life, to learn each other's rhythms and habits. Preston taught Hannah to read animal tracks in the snow, and she taught him to cook something more elaborate than beans and cornbread. They read books in the evening by lamplight, worked on expanding the house, made plans for the spring. In early spring, Hannah told him she was pregnant. Preston's first reaction was fear, vivid and sharp. A child meant more vulnerability, more to lose. But looking at Hannah's face, seeing her joy and hope, the fear receded. This was not something to be afraid of. This was what living actually looked like. Their son was born in late summer of 1877, a healthy baby with Preston's dark hair and Hannah's green eyes. They named him Matthew, after Preston's brother, and when Preston held him for the first time, he felt tears on his face for the first time in years. "Your Uncle Matthew would have loved to meet you," he whispered to the sleeping infant. "I wish you could have known him." Hannah, exhausted but radiant from the birthing, reached out and took Preston's hand. "Tell our Matthew about him," she said. "Tell him stories, so he knows the kind of man his uncle was. That way, he'll never really be gone." Preston nodded, unable to speak past the lump in his throat. He understood what she was offering him, a way to honor the past while still embracing the future. A way to carry his brother with him without being trapped by grief. Life settled into a new rhythm. The mine continued to produce well, and they hired a foreman to oversee the day-to-day operations, freeing Preston and Hannah to focus on their family. Preston's horse training business grew as his reputation spread. He found he liked teaching others, sharing his skills in a way he never would have imagined in his years of solitude. More children came. A daughter named Eliza 2 years after Matthew, with Hannah's determination and stubbornness. Another son, James, 2 years after that, quiet and thoughtful like his father. Their house expanded to accommodate the growing family, rooms added year by year. What had started as a simple structure grew into a proper home, filled with noise and laughter and life. Preston watched his children grow with a mixture of wonder and terror. Every time one of them got sick or had an accident, he felt that old fear rise up, the certainty that caring meant losing. But Hannah was always there to ground him, to remind him that fear could not be allowed to stop them from living fully. One evening when Matthew was 10 and asking about the war, Preston found himself able to talk about it in a way he never had before. He told his son about the fear and the chaos, but also about the courage and the loyalty between soldiers. He told him about Uncle Matthew, about the kind of person he had been and the sacrifice he had made. And in telling the stories, Preston found they lost some of their power to hurt him. They became memories he could carry instead of weights that dragged him down. As years passed, Preston remained involved in the Williams community in ways he never would have thought possible. He helped his neighbors, trained their horses, shared his knowledge freely. He and Hannah hosted dinners and attended church socials. They became known as pillars of the community, reliable and generous. It was a far cry from the isolated, bitter man he had been when Hannah stumbled into his life. Sometimes, usually in the early morning before the rest of the family woke. Preston would sit on his porch with his coffee and think about how close he had come to sending Hannah away that first day. If he had been just a little bit more stubborn, a little bit more committed to his solitude, he would have missed all of this. The love, the family, the sense of purpose and connection. It was sobering to realize how thin the line was between the life he had and the empty existence he might have had. Hannah would often join him on those mornings, moving quietly so as not to wake the children. They would sit together in comfortable silence, watching the sun paint the sky with light. No words were needed. After so many years together, they could communicate in glances and touches, in the simple comfort of shared presence. The children grew and eventually began lives of their own. Matthew went to university in California, studying engineering. Eliza married a young lawyer from Prescott and started her own family. James stayed close to home, taking over the management of the mine and showing a talent for business that exceeded either of his parents. Preston and Hannah grew older together, their hair graying, their movements slowing but their connection deepening with each passing year. The mine eventually played out, the gold finally exhausted, but by then they had more than enough money set aside. They sold the claim and focused on the horse ranch, which had grown into one of the most respected operations in the territory. Arizona achieved statehood in their later years, and they celebrated with their children and grandchildren gathered around them. Preston looked at the faces of his family, all of them existing because he had made the choice to help a desperate woman instead of turning her away, and felt gratitude so profound it was almost painful. On a warm evening in the spring of 1903, Preston and Hannah sat on their porch as they had done thousands of times before. They were in their 70s now, both still healthy but feeling the weight of their years. The ranch spread out before them, well maintained by James and his workers. Grandchildren played in the yard, their laughter carrying on the breeze. "You ever regret it?" Hannah asked suddenly. "Giving up your solitude, taking a chance on me?" Preston turned to look at his wife of more than 25 years. Her hair was white now, her face lined with age, but to him she was as beautiful as the day he had first seen her in his yard, desperate and determined and brave. "Never," he said firmly. "Not even for a moment. You showed me something I had forgotten, something I thought was lost to me forever." "What's that?" Hannah asked, though he thought she knew the answer. "You showed me that life is meant to be shared," Preston said. "That solitude might feel safe, but togetherness is what makes life worth living. You taught me that the risk of loss is worth taking if it means having love and connection and purpose. You saved me, Hannah, just as surely as I helped save you that day." Hannah reached over and took his hand, her grip still strong despite her age. "We saved each other," she said. "That's what love is, I think. Two people choosing each other, over and over, even when it's hard, especially when it's hard." They sat in silence as the sun set, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. Around them, their family continued their activities, the next generation and the one after that carrying forward the legacy that Preston and Hannah had built. It had all started with a single choice on a dusty morning in 1876, when a solitary man decided that maybe, just maybe, he could risk caring one more time. As darkness fell and the stars began to emerge, Preston reflected on the journey that had brought him here. From the battlefields of Tennessee to the isolation of his cabin to this moment surrounded by family and love, it had been a long and winding path. But he would not change any of it. Every scar, every loss, every moment of pain had led him to Hannah and to the life they had built together. "Thank you," he said quietly. "For what?" Hannah asked. "For not giving up on me," Preston said. "For seeing something worth saving even when I couldn't see it myself. for showing me the beauty of togetherness when I was content with solitude." Hannah squeezed his hand. "You're welcome. And thank you for taking a chance on a desperate woman with nowhere else to turn. Thank you for choosing to live again instead of just existing." They continued sitting together as the night deepened, their hands intertwined, their hearts still beating in rhythm after all these years. They had built a good life, a full life, rich with love and family and purpose. And it had all begun with a choice to reach out instead of turning away, to risk connection instead of hiding in isolation. In the house behind them, they could hear their children and grandchildren preparing to leave, saying their goodbyes. Soon Preston and Hannah would go inside to their bedroom, to the bed they had shared for decades. They would lie down together as they had countless times before, and they would fall asleep in each other's arms, grateful for another day together. But for now, they remained on the porch, two people who had found each other when they both needed it most, who had built something beautiful and lasting from desperate beginnings. Preston thought about the man he had been, bitter and alone and convinced that solitude was the only safe path. That man seemed like a stranger now, someone from another life entirely. Hannah had changed everything. She had taken his careful isolation and shattered it, replacing it with something infinitely better. Together, they had created a family, a legacy, a life worth living. And while Preston had once been content with solitude, he now understood that true contentment came from togetherness, from sharing both burdens and joys with someone who chose to walk beside you through all of life's challenges. As they finally rose to go inside, Preston took one last look at the land they had built their life upon. The mountains in the distance, the ranch spreading out below, the house filled with the echoes of children and grandchildren. All of it was possible because of one simple truth. Love was worth the risk. Connection was worth the vulnerability. Togetherness was worth more than any amount of safety found in solitude. They walked inside together, Preston's arm around Hannah's waist, her head leaning against his shoulder. Behind them, the door closed softly, shutting out the night. And within the walls of the home they had made, surrounded by the evidence of a life well lived and deeply shared, Preston James finally understood what his brother had wanted for him all those years ago on that bloody battlefield in Tennessee. Matthew had not just wanted Preston to survive. He had wanted him to truly live, to love, to build something meaningful with whatever years he was given. It had taken Preston a long time to honor that wish, but with Hannah's help, he had finally done it. He had lived enough for both of them, and in doing so, had found a peace and happiness he never could have imagined. That night, lying in bed with his wife in his arms, Preston closed his eyes knowing that tomorrow would bring another day of life shared, of togetherness chosen over solitude. And that was enough, more than enough. It was everything